In the quiet countryside, where rolling hills met wide-open skies, nobody expected a luxury car to become the center of a neighborhood war. A wealthy newcomer moved into the edge of a farming community, bringing with her the polished shine of city life and the entitled attitude of someone who thought rules didn't apply to her. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the kind who saw every inconvenience as an insult, every small detail as beneath her. And when her prized luxury vehicle clashed with the rough reality of farmland living, she unleashed a storm that rattled the entire community. But what she never imagined was that the very people she tried to control were already preparing a reckoning, one that would leave her humiliated in ways she never thought possible. This is the story of how one Karen's obsession with her luxury ride turned into the fight of her life, and why the farm she underestimated became the place of her greatest downfall. The countryside had always been a place of rhythm. Days began before sunrise, with the low rumble of tractors starting their engines, the crows of roosters echoing across wide fields, and the faint smell of tilled soil drifting with the morning breeze. Life in this farming community was simple, but steady. Families had lived on this land for generations, bound by traditions that went deeper than the roots of the crops they tended. That balance began to shift the day Karen arrived. She came not quietly, but in a spectacle of polished wealth and city pride. Her imported luxury SUV glided down the gravel road like a gleaming foreign guest lost in a place it didn't belong. The vehicle's glossy black paint reflected the countryside skies, but its presence contrasted sharply against the dust-coated trucks and mud-splattered farm vehicles that dominated the area. Karen had purchased the large white house at the far edge of the farmland, a property that once belonged to an old couple who had finally retired. It was no ordinary farmhouse. It had been renovated with marble countertops, a private gate, and an attached 3-car garage. In many ways, the house already felt out of place, and now its new owner embodied that same sense of displacement. From the moment she stepped out of her vehicle, Karen's demeanor carried entitlement. She glanced at her surroundings with a mixture of disdain and suspicion, as if every grain of dust was a personal insult. Her polished heels clicked against the driveway, a sound that didn't belong in the countryside, where boots and work shoes were the norm. For the neighbors who peeked from across fields and fences, it was clear this woman was not here to adapt. She was here to make the land adapt to her. At first, the community extended its usual courtesy. Farmers tipped their hats as they passed by her house, and one family even brought over a basket of fresh eggs and vegetables as a welcome gesture. Karen accepted these with a tight smile, her eyes already drifting back toward her luxury SUV, checking for any signs of dust or scratches. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. She wasn't rude in words, but her body language spoke volumes. She believed she was above this place. The SUV became the centerpiece of her new life here, parked perfectly in the center of her driveway, always spotless. It shone like a monument to her status, but the countryside had its own way of humbling pride. Every time a tractor passed by on the gravel road, a cloud of dust would settle across her polished paint. Every time the wind carried soil from the fields, faint layers of dirt would cling to its surface. And every time she drove down to the nearest town, her tires came back coated with mud. To Karen, this was unacceptable. She had spent years building her image, curating every detail of her life to present wealth, elegance, and superiority. And now, the very land itself seemed to conspire against her. She muttered to herself about backward living and low standards, already resenting the people who had lived here long before she had ever considered it. The tension grew with small incidents. She winced at the sound of roosters crowing too early, clutching her designer robe tighter as she stepped outside to glare toward the farms. She scowled at children riding their bikes near her property, convinced their muddy tires might somehow graze her car. She shook her head disapprovingly at farmers hauling hay bales past her road, calling the sight unsightly. The community, used to newcomers occasionally moving in, sensed this was different. She wasn't simply adjusting. She was preparing to complain, to impose, to bend the environment into her vision of perfection. And they were right, because soon, Karen began to speak more openly. She complained about the gravel road to the mailman, insisting it should be paved because it lowers her property value. She muttered about the smell of livestock drifting from a neighboring farm, wrinkling her nose as though she had walked into something vile. At the local store, she scoffed about how primitive the area seemed compared to where she came from. Word traveled fast in such a small community, and by the end of her first week, nearly everyone had heard of the new woman who seemed allergic to farm life. But what truly unsettled the neighbors wasn't her attitude alone. It was the way she clung to her luxury ride, guarding it with an obsession that felt almost personal. She washed it every other day, polishing it until the sun danced across its surface. She installed cameras facing her driveway, muttering about keeping it safe. And when dust inevitably settled again, she would be seen furiously wiping it down, her frustration spilling into muttered complaints about dirty farmers and careless locals. For the farmers, whose vehicles were tools rather than trophies, her behavior seemed absurd. Trucks here carried hay, dirt, and equipment. They weren't meant to shine, they were meant to work. But to Karen, her SUV wasn't just a car. It was her identity, her proof that she didn't belong in this world of grit and grime, and that obsession, that constant battle between her pride and the farm's reality, would be the very spark that set the community on a path toward conflict. Because while Karen believed her wealth and sophistication gave her control, she had underestimated the spirit of the land she now lived on. This farm community had weathered storms, droughts, and hardships far greater than a polished newcomer's complaints. And when the time came, they would remind her that no car, no matter how shiny, could outshine the strength of those who worked the land every single day. The stage was set, the luxury ride gleamed under the sun. The community watched silently, waiting, and Karen, she had no idea that her war with dust, mud, and tradition was only beginning. The first few weeks after Karen's arrival passed like slow-burning fire. At first, neighbors tolerated her presence with polite smiles, though they whispered behind closed doors. But soon, patience began to wear thin. What had been subtle disapproval in her eyes and muttered words under her breath quickly transformed into written complaints, official calls, and a trail of trouble that reached far beyond her spotless driveway. It started with the dust. The gravel roads, carved years ago by farm trucks and maintained by the county in their own rugged way, were never meant to be clean. Every car, every tractor, every bicycle kicked up a cloud of dirt that settled across fields, porches, and windshields. For locals, it was part of the rhythm of life, as common as the sunrise. But for Karen, it was nothing short of an attack. Her luxury SUV, freshly waxed and polished, became a magnet for her fury. She couldn't tolerate the film of dust that clung to the dark paint after a single trip down the lane. The first time it happened, she was seen in her driveway for hours, scrubbing and polishing, as though she were restoring a priceless artifact. The second time, her frustration boiled over, and she fired off her first letter to the county office. The letter was long, filled with complaints about how unacceptable the roads were, how unsanitary it was For her car to be constantly exposed to such conditions, and how outrageous it was that she should have to endure this after investing in such a valuable property. She demanded the roads be paved, not for safety, not for necessity, but because the dust was beneath her standards. The county, already burdened with larger issues, filed her letter away with little more than a polite acknowledgement. But Karen wasn't finished. She believed persistence was power. Next came the livestock complaints. From her fenced yard, she could see stretches of farmland dotted with cattle, sheep, and goats. To Karen, the sight of animals grazing was not picturesque. It was offensive. She hated the way the smell of manure drifted into her open windows, clashing with the expensive candles she burned inside her home. She complained about the noise of cows lowing at dusk and sheep bleating in the morning, as if these sounds were interruptions to the life she thought she deserved. Neighbors began receiving sharp notes slipped into their mailboxes. She accused one farmer of keeping unsanitary animals too close to her property line. Another was scolded for allowing farm smells to carry into residential zones, though her house sat in the very heart of agricultural land. Each note carried the same undertone. Karen believed she was the guardian of some higher standard, and the rest of the community was dragging her down. The complaints escalated further when Karen noticed chickens wandering near her property, too. The farmers, chickens roaming across fields, were harmless, an ordinary part of daily life. But to Karen, they were trespassers. She accused her neighbor of deliberately letting them loose to harass her, threatening to report the matter to animal control. She told anyone who would listen that the presence of these birds could damage her car, scratching the paint or dirtying the tires. But what truly made the community turn against her was the complaint about the roosters. Every morning, long before dawn, their calls echoed across the fields, signaling the start of the day. For farmers, this was tradition. For Karen, it was torture. She called the township office repeatedly, insisting something be done to control the noise pollution. Officials explained, patiently at first, that roosters were part of rural living, that she had moved into their world, not the other way around. But Karen wouldn't accept it. To her, compromise was defeat. Her sense of superiority began to spill into her everyday behavior. At the local grocery store, she complained loudly about the stench of farm clothes when standing in line behind workers fresh from the fields. She demanded the store keep her groceries bagged separately so her car wouldn't absorb rural odors. At the small diner in town, she snapped at waitresses for allowing muddy boots inside. She made sure everyone knew she considered herself above the place she had chosen to live. The tension was no longer quiet. Farmers who had once offered polite greetings now turned their backs when she passed. Children whispered about her strange behavior, laughing when they saw her polishing her SUV for the third time in a single day. Even the mailman, who had tried to remain neutral, sighed each time he delivered another stack of her typed complaints addressed to the county, the township, or her neighbors. But Karen thrived on the idea that she was shaking things up. She believed the community's cold stares meant they feared her influence, not that they resented her. She saw herself as a reformer, someone bringing civilization to a place she considered backward. And with each ignored letter or brushed off call, she grew more determined, convinced that persistence would force the world to bend. The breaking point of this chapter came one afternoon when a tractor rolled past her home, hauling bales of hay down the gravel road. Dust billowed high, drifting across her driveway and settling thickly onto the surface of her prized vehicle. Karen stormed outside, coughing theatrically as though the air itself had been poisoned. She snapped photos of her SUV, coated with the faint haze of dirt, and shouted across the fields at the farmer, her voice carrying shrill notes of outrage. The farmer, used to dust as much as he was to rain, simply kept driving, unfazed, but Karen wasn't finished. That evening, she sat down at her computer, crafting yet another furious letter. This one wasn't just to the county. It was copied to the township, to a legal office she had contacted, and to her neighbors directly. She accused the community of negligence, of failing to respect her property, and of deliberately lowering her standards of living. She even threatened to sue for damages to her vehicle, claiming emotional distress from the constant harassment of rural life. The letter spread quickly, passed from one farmer to another, until nearly the entire community had seen it. Some laughed at its absurdity. Others clenched their fists, realizing her complaints were no longer a private nuisance, but a public insult. She hadn't just looked down on them. She had declared war. The complaints were no longer words on paper. They were seeds of conflict, planted firmly in the soil of the community. And as with anything planted in fertile ground, it was only a matter of time before they grew into something far larger than Karen ever intended. The tension between Karen and the farming community had reached a boiling point. What began as muttered complaints and snide letters had now grown into open hostility. Though Karen still believed she held the upper hand, she convinced herself that her persistence would eventually bend the locals into submission. But she had underestimated one thing. The patience of farmers had limits, and once broken, their resolve was far stronger than she could ever imagine. The heart of the conflict remained her obsession with her luxury SUV. To Karen, it was more than just a car. It was the crown jewel of her identity, proof that she belonged to a higher class than those around her. Every smudge, every speck of dust, every mark on its glossy surface was a personal insult. She treated her vehicle with the care of a museum curator, while dismissing the hard-working machines around her as eyesores, the tractors, the hay wagons, the weather-worn trucks. All of them were, in her eyes, the filth that threatened her perfection. One autumn afternoon, the clash became unavoidable. The farmers were hauling heavy loads of hay to prepare for the coming cold. Their tractors rumbled steadily along the gravel road, wheels grinding against loose stones, raising the inevitable clouds of dust that drifted freely across the countryside. Karen, anticipating this, had parked her SUV as far forward in her driveway as possible, positioned perfectly to show it off, while she washed the windshield for the third time that week. As the tractor rolled by, its massive tires caught a patch of mud near the ditch, flinging a streak of wet soil into the air. The splatter arced high and fell directly onto the edge of Karen's pristine vehicle. To anyone else, it was a small inconvenience, something that could be wiped off with a rag. But to Karen, it was nothing short of sabotage. Her face twisted with fury as she rushed toward the car, gasping dramatically at the sight of the mud streak across the glossy black paint. Without hesitation, she marched to the edge of the road, screaming accusations across the field at the farmer in the tractor. She shouted that he had done it on purpose, that he was targeting her, that she would have him reported and sued for damages. The farmer, barely glancing her way, kept driving. To him, mud was part of life. To her, it was war. That evening, Karen doubled down. She stormed into town, filing yet another complaint, this time framed as deliberate harassment. She told anyone who would listen that she was being targeted by jealous neighbors, that her car had been attacked, and that she feared for her safety. But unlike before, people weren't sympathetic. They exchanged knowing looks, shook their heads, and whispered to one another the woman with the luxury ride had finally lost touch with reality. From that day on, her paranoia deepened. She began parking her SUV in odd places, far from trees or the road, convinced that someone would intentionally dirty it. She lined her driveway with security cameras, their blinking red lights casting a glow over the gravel at night. She even erected a temporary canopy over the car. Though the open countryside winds tore at it relentlessly, every precaution she took only made her look more out of place, more alien in a community that valued resilience over obsession. But her behavior wasn't just strange. It was disruptive. She started chasing down farmers in their trucks, flagging them to stop so she could yell about dust clouds. She blocked part of the road one morning, refusing to move her car until the driver of a tractor promised to take another route. Word spread quickly, and with each incident, the farmers' patience thinned. They had work to do, real work, tied to the survival of their families and animals, and they weren't going to bow to a woman whose battles were with dust and mud. The clash of worlds became visible in every interaction. When the children of one farming family pedaled past her home on their bicycles, their tires flinging up small flecks of dirt, Karen stormed out onto the driveway, waving her arms and shouting that they were disrespecting her property. The children, confused and frightened, hurried away, while their parents fumed in silence, deciding how much more they were willing to take. When a local farmer parked his mud-splattered trucks at the grocery store beside her SUV, Karen waited until he left and then snapped photos, convinced he had intentionally chosen that spot to make her car look inferior. She circulated the photos online, accusing the community of bullying her. The post backfired spectacularly, as locals banded together in the comments, sharing their own frustrations with her antics. For Karen, this only confirmed her belief that the town was against her. She told herself she was the victim, a misunderstood outsider surrounded by backward people who couldn't handle her standards. But for the community, the truth was simpler. She was no longer a neighbor, but an adversary. The turning point of this chapter came on a windy day in late October. A convoy of tractors rolled down the gravel road, carrying loads of harvested corn. Karen stood at her driveway, glaring as the dust swirled higher than usual, carried by gusts of wind. Her SUV, though covered by its temporary canopy, still caught the brunt of the haze. She snapped into action, recording videos on her phone, narrating dramatically about how she was being terrorized. She shouted across the fields, waving her arms, her voice shrill against the low rumble of engines. But this time, the farmers stopped. 3 tractors idled on the road, their drivers exchanging glances before climbing down. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply looked at her, the way people look at a storm they've had enough of enduring. Karen, camera in hand, tried to lecture them about property values, about damages, about her right to cleanliness, but her words faltered under their silent stares. For the first time, she realized she might not be untouchable. The farmers returned to their tractors without a word, engines roaring back to life as they continued down the road. But the message had been delivered clearly. Their patience had limits, and she was dangerously close to crossing them. Karen returned to her SUV that night, scrubbing furiously at its surface, whispering to herself about lawsuits and revenge. She still believed she could win this war, but the truth had shifted. The community, once tolerant of her antics, was no longer laughing. They were preparing, quietly and collectively, to stand against her. The clash of worlds was no longer about dust or mud. It was about respect, pride, and survival. And as the lines were drawn, Karen remained blind to the reality that she was outnumbered, outmatched, and heading straight for a reckoning she could never polish away. By the time the leaves began to turn and the air carried the chill of late autumn, the tension between Karen and the farming community had transformed from nuisance into open hostility. What had once been whispers behind fences and quiet eye rolls in town had grown into something heavier, something that no longer floated lightly on gossip, but settled deep into the bones of every neighbor. The farmers had reached their limit, and though Karen believed her persistence would eventually wear them down, she had no idea she was the one being worn thin. Her grip on the illusion of control, slipping with each passing day, her luxury SUV remained the centerpiece of her battles. Standing polished and gleaming in stark contrast to the weather-worn trucks and tractors that surrounded it, she spent hours each week buffing its paint, adjusting its parking angle, checking the cameras she had installed to protect it. But no matter what she did, dust always returned, mud always splattered, and the countryside always reminded her that perfection had no place here. What should have been small inconveniences became, in her mind, orchestrated attacks. The real escalation began with her formal complaints. She wasn't content anymore with muttered words or scolding notes. She filed documented grievances with the county, accusing the farmers of negligence and harassment. She reported unsafe driving conditions on gravel roads, toxic air, quality from dust clouds, and animal intrusions that she insisted were part of a campaign to make her miserable. Each complaint was more exaggerated than the last, painting her as a victim, surrounded by reckless and uncaring people. The county officials, already weary of her endless calls, sent an inspector to review her claims. On a brisk morning, the white county truck pulled into her driveway, and Karen eagerly guided the inspector through her evidence. She pointed to faint streaks of dust on her SUV, to the distant cattle grazing across the fence line, to the rooster crowing from a neighbor's yard. She spoke passionately about property values, her tone dripping with indignation. But as the inspector quietly took notes, it became clear her complaints carried little weight. Dust on gravel roads was natural. Animals grazing were legal. The rooster's crow was not a violation of any ordinance. By the time the visit ended, Karen's confident smile had faltered. The inspector left with a polite nod, and though he promised to file the report, his tone suggested nothing would come of it. For the community, however, the damage had been done. Her decision to involve authorities crossed an invisible line. Farmers who had once tolerated her eccentricities now saw her as a genuine threat. She wasn't just a difficult neighbor anymore. She was an enemy willing to waste government resources, threaten livelihoods, and disrupt the way of life they had protected for generations. Quiet conversations around dinner tables turned into late-night strategy meetings, neighbors gathering to discuss how far she might go and what they needed to do to protect themselves. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder. She convinced herself the inspector's polite dismissal was only temporary, that if she kept pushing, she would force change. She doubled the frequency of her calls, demanding follow-ups, demanding results. She posted on community forums, ranting about the backward conditions of the area. She sent letters, not just to the county, but to state representatives, painting herself as a victim trapped in a hostile environment. Her obsession consumed her. Each morning, she stood at her window, recording videos of passing tractors, narrating angrily about reckless drivers and clouds of poison. She filed small claims against 2 neighbors, demanding compensation for alleged damage to her SUV. Though both claims were quickly dismissed, the act itself was enough to harden the farmer's resolve. The breaking point came on a cold, windy afternoon in November. A farmer down the road was transporting a load of feed in his truck. As he slowed to turn near Karen's property, a gust of wind carried a spray of loose straw across the ditch and into her yard. Most of it landed harmlessly on the ground, but a few pieces clung to the windshield of her luxury SUV. Karen exploded. She stormed outside, waving her arms, shouting accusations at the farmer as though he had hurled the straw deliberately. She snapped photos, paced in circles, and screamed about criminal damage. The farmer, exhausted from a day's work, ignored her, driving away without a word. But Karen wasn't finished. She called the sheriff's office, her voice trembling with rage as she claimed she was being harassed, targeted, and endangered. When the sheriff arrived later that evening, the truth unraveled. He looked at the SUV, at the few stray pieces of straw stuck to the windshield, and then at Karen, who was demanding an official arrest. His expression hardened, and with measured patience, he explained that no law had been broken. Her face twisted. With disbelief, as if the world itself had betrayed her, the sheriff left with a warning of his own. Misuse of emergency services carried consequences. Word spread quickly through the community. The farmers, already united in their frustration, saw the incident as the final straw. Karen had crossed beyond nuisance into outright danger, wasting official resources and threatening the stability of their lives. They began documenting her every move, collecting evidence of her false claims, her trespasses, her harassment. They shared their findings quietly, neighbor to neighbor, until a thick file of proof began to form. Karen, oblivious to the storm, gathering around her, celebrated what she thought was progress. She told herself the sheriff's visit proved her importance, that her persistence was forcing recognition. She couldn't see that she was pushing herself closer to isolation, her credibility eroding with each outburst. The farm community, however, saw her more clearly than ever. They no longer viewed her as a bothersome outsider, but as a threat to their way of life, and they weren't going to let her tear apart what generations of families had built. The breaking point had been reached. The farmers were done waiting. Quietly, firmly, and with unity, they began preparing to push back. Karen's war was no longer with dust and mud. It was with the community itself, and she had no idea just how strong that community could be when united against someone who had made herself the enemy. By the time the first frost spread its silver veil across the fields, the farmers had silently drawn their line in the dirt. They had tolerated Karen's outbursts, her endless complaints, and her obsession with her spotless luxury SUV for far too long. What began as irritation had grown into defiance, and now the community stood shoulder to shoulder, determined to defend their way of life. For them, Karen was no longer a problem to ignore. She was a threat to neutralize. The file of evidence against her grew thick. Neighbors shared stories of her blocking the road, recording children on their bikes, harassing truck drivers, and filing frivolous claims that wasted hours of county resources. Each story came with photos, videos, and witness statements. Farmers who rarely bothered with paperwork or formalities now found themselves carefully documenting every interaction, knowing that the day would come when this collection of truth would matter. Meanwhile, Karen still believed she held the upper hand. To her, the silence of her neighbors meant they were backing down. She told herself that her persistence was working, that the sheriff's warnings were empty, and that her SUV's pristine shine was a symbol of her untouchable status. She polished it daily, even as the wind cut through her jacket and frost numbed her fingers. She spoke aloud to herself about lawsuits and property values, convinced she was standing for something noble, when in reality, she was standing alone. The reckoning began with whispers. At the town's small diner, farmers leaned close over steaming mugs of coffee, planning their next steps. At church, conversations after service lingered on how much more they would allow. At the feed store, neighbors exchanged nods, their unspoken agreement clear. The time for passive patience was over. Their plan was not one of revenge, but of exposure. Karen thrived on drama, twisting narratives to paint herself as the victim. The farmers knew the only way to end her reign of disruption was to strip away her illusions and show the truth plainly, not just to officials, but to the entire community. The moment arrived sooner than expected. On a windy afternoon, Karen staged what she thought would be her greatest proof of harassment. She parked her SUV near the road, instead of under its canopy, positioning it so that any passing vehicle might kick up dirt. She set up her cameras, rehearsed her speech, and waited like a hunter at the edge of a blind. When a convoy of tractors rolled past, the gravel crunched beneath their tires, and dust lifted into the air, just as it always had. Karen leapt into action. She recorded frantically, screaming into her phone about being attacked, about deliberate sabotage, about danger, and damages. Her words were wild, her gestures frantic. What she didn't realize was that half the town was already watching. The farmers had tipped off the sheriff, the inspector, and even a few local journalists about Karen's behavior. They stood quietly at a distance, observing the spectacle. As Karen waved her arms and stomped her feet in a cloud of dust of her own choosing, cameras captured not her suffering, but her theatrics. Her evidence collapsed under the weight of its own exaggeration. The sheriff stepped forward at last, firm and unyielding. He confronted Karen, not with sympathy, but with the thick file of documented complaints the community had assembled. He read aloud her false claims, her repeated misuse of emergency services, her harassment of neighbors and their children. Each page turned was another nail in the coffin of her credibility. Karen's face flushed crimson as the crowd watched in silence. She sputtered excuses, pointed fingers, and accused the farmers of conspiring against her. But the sheriff's voice cut through her protests with calm authority. Enough was enough. The consequences were immediate. Her frivolous complaints were dismissed. She was fined for repeated misuse of county resources. Restraining orders were issued to protect neighbors she had harassed. And perhaps most crushing of all, the glossy reputation she had built for herself crumbled in the eyes of the town. Where she once believed herself admired for her wealth and style, she now saw only cold stares and shaking heads. The reckoning was not loud or violent. It was quiet, firm, and absolute. The community did not need to shout. They only needed to stand together, and that unity proved stronger than any single complaint or threat Karen could conjure. For Karen, it was a blow she had not anticipated. She retreated into her house, curtains drawn, her SUV sitting untouched in the driveway for days. The woman who had once paraded her car as a crown jewel now avoided looking at it, the shine dulled by frost and neglect. Her cameras blinked uselessly in the night, capturing nothing but the silence of neighbors who had stopped caring about her antics. But beneath her humiliation, Karen's pride smoldered. She whispered to herself in the dark, convincing herself this was only a setback. She scribbled notes of new plans, new angles, new ways to reclaim control. She told herself the farmers had won a battle, but not the war. The community, however, felt the shift. For the first time in months, there was peace along the gravel roads. Children rode their bikes without fear of being shouted at. farmers drove their tractors without looking over their shoulders. Neighbors greeted one another with relief. The heavy tension of constant conflict finally lifted. Yet beneath the calm, everyone knew one thing. Karen was not finished. Pride that deep, obsession that fierce, did not fade overnight. The reckoning had humbled her, but it had not broken her. And as winter approached, with its storms and hardships, both Karen and the community braced themselves for what might come next, because the war between a spotless SUV and the dusty reality of farm life was not over. It had only shifted to its next, inevitable stage. Winter descended heavy and unrelenting. The fields froze beneath layers of ice. Tractors crawled through, biting winds, and the gravel roads turned treacherous with snow-packed ruts. For the farmers, this was simply another season to endure, a challenge written into the rhythm of their lives. But for Karen, winter became a prison. Her once pristine luxury SUV, the symbol of her pride, stood awkwardly beneath a makeshift canopy. Its paint dulled by salt and grit. Where once she spent hours polishing, she now stood at the window, staring bitterly at it. The frost-covered glass reflected back not a crown jewel, but a mocking reminder of everything she had lost. The reckoning had humiliated her, her complaints dismissed, her reputation shattered, yet her pride clung stubbornly, whispering that there was still a way to rise again. She tried to reclaim control in small ways. She drafted angry letters to the county, rewording her old accusations with new exaggerations. She spoke aloud of conspiracies, insisting the farmers had plotted to destroy her credibility. But each letter returned with the same response: dismissed. Her words carried no weight anymore. Officials had grown immune to her voice, the echo of her complaints bouncing back into silence. The community, however, thrived in her absence. The farmers plowed, harvested, and repaired machinery without interference. Children played freely along the gravel roads. The air was lighter, the tension gone, as though the entire town had collectively exhaled after months of holding its breath. They spoke of her less and less, and when her name did surface, it was only in passing, a shadow of a story that was quickly forgotten. But Karen could not let go. Her obsession with the SUV became her last tether to the illusion of superiority. She convinced herself that if she could restore its shine, protect it from the elements, and parade it proudly once more, she could reclaim her standing. She invested in expensive cleaning supplies, ordered custom covers, and even hired a detailer from the city to make the car sparkle again. The farmers watched quietly as she worked feverishly, her figure bent against the cold, scrubbing and polishing while snow flurries swirled around her. To them, it was pitiful, almost tragic. She was no longer a threat, just a woman locked in, battle with the countryside itself, a battle she could never win. The final fallout arrived one night in January. A storm swept across the valley, fierce and unyielding. Snow piled in drifts along the roads. Winds howled against barns and houses, and temperatures plummeted below freezing. For the farmers, it was a call to action. Animals had to be sheltered, equipment had to be checked, and families had to be kept warm. The entire community worked together, shoveling paths, delivering firewood, and checking on one another. Karen, however, had other priorities. While the storm raged, she dragged out tarps and ropes. Determined to build a sturdier shelter for her SUV, she fought against the wind, clutching fabric that whipped violently in the air, shouting in frustration as snow stung her face. She wrapped the vehicle in layer after layer, tying knots with frozen fingers, muttering about protection and value. But the storm was merciless. By morning, her makeshift shelter, had collapsed under the weight of snow. The ropes snapped, the tarps tore, and the SUV sat buried beneath a thick blanket of ice and slush. The sight broke her. She wailed loudly, in her driveway, her voice carrying across the fields. But this time no one came to watch. No one cared. The community was busy with real struggles, and Karen's cries were swallowed by the wind. In the days that followed, her SUV refused to start. The cold had seeped deep into its engine, and her repeated attempts to revive it only drained the battery further. She called mechanics, but the storm kept them from traveling. She begged for help on local forums, but the silence was deafening. Where once she had been a source of gossip and frustration, she was now invisible, ignored by the very people she had tormented. The final fallout was not explosive or dramatic. It was quiet. It was Karen standing alone in her frozen driveway, staring at the car that had once been her crown and now was nothing more than a lifeless hunk of metal beneath the snow. It was the realization that she had fought everyone and lost, not because they were stronger, but because they were united and she was not. The farmers carried on, their lives tied to the land and to one another. They no longer wasted energy on her. To them, Karen was just a chapter that had closed, a lesson in resilience and community strength. For Karen, the silence was the cruelest punishment. No one shouted at her. No one argued. No one even looked her way. She had wanted to be the center of attention, the figure who bent the community to her will. Instead, she became a ghost in her own story, remembered only for the chaos she brought and the emptiness she left behind. As winter dragged on, the SUV remained buried, the shine long gone, and with it, so too faded Karen's pride. She stayed inside more often, curtains drawn, her world shrinking to the walls of her house. The woman who once believed she could conquer a farm town with lawsuits, and Polish now faced the truth. She had been defeated not by dust or mud, but by her own arrogance. The final fallout was not the loss of her SUV. It was the loss of her voice, her influence, her ability to command fear or respect. She had become irrelevant, and for someone like Karen, irrelevance was the deepest cut of all. And so, the luxury ride that once gleamed like a jewel met its end not in glory, but in silence, swallowed whole by a farm community that refused to be broken.